Good morning, everyone. I'll start with a question. If you could please raise your hand if you've used a conversational AI in the last few days to search for information. How many of us? That's quite the majority of us. My name is Adaka, and I'm an assistant professor at Stanford University. I study memory processes and consumer decision-making. And today I'm very excited for this opportunity to talk to you about an intersection of my core research interests: memory, as well as conversational AI, and the cognitive implications of these two. This is joint work with my collaborators, Denis Lefkeli and Konstantin Pekal. There's no doubt that conversational AI has revolutionized the way consumers gather information, access it, as well as retain that particular information. If you think about it, all of the responses that our chatbots give, the large language models they work with, the types of language that you see in the outputs, that's going to be very particular in nature. So you might be seeing informal language, there is a conversational tone, there are additional words, what we call them discourse markers, for example, that connect the language with one another. And all of these things might have some cognitive implications. And the way in which we all search for information these days have shifted towards conversational AI, such that we predict there will be some cognitive consequences as well. And that's what we're going to be studying in this particular project. Before I begin to that, though, what I'm interested in looking at is identifying the situations in which people prefer using conversational AI instead of traditional search engines to be able to see where should we even start looking at? What types of questions do people ask conversational AI? And then once we identify, if we can identify reliably the types of questions people go to conversational AI, then we can look at these downstream consequences or the outcomes. For this, we turn our attention to the practitioners who classify people's search queries in terms of different motivations, goals, and intents that they have. This is called the mapping of the search intents, or sometimes the user intents. And there are 4 different categories. People might want to gather information, so the informational search queries. There are also other types, such as commercial, if you're interested in finding the price of a particular shoe or the other one. You might just be interested in going to Facebook, so finding the link of a particular web browser or web link, and then you might be purchasing something which would be classified as transactional. And in our framework, what we're hypothesizing is that even though people use the internet for all these sorts of search queries, only the informational ones are going to be relatively more likely to appear in conversational AI, as opposed to Google or traditional search engines. So that's going to be the very first thing that we're going to test to be able to basically set the groundwork for us to be able to see what types of search queries we should further explore. We had 2 very similar parallel studies in which we gave participants 20 different statements. Each of these statements was a different search query coming from the search intents I just presented to you. And then we asked them, which one do you think would provide you with more useful information, or simply which one would you use in a different study? And as we hypothesized, what we see is that people prefer conversational AI relative to traditional search engines only for the informational search queries. So if we look at this graph here, on the x-axis, you see all of the different search queries, and on the y-axis, it's a mean preference. The bars that are above 0 would mean a relative preference for traditional search engines like Google, and the bars below 0 would mean a relative preference for conversational AI. And this was the same across both of our studies, but I'm just presenting you the first one here. Okay, so what does that even mean for us? Moving forward, we're only going to concentrate on informational queries, or the situations in which people have a goal or a motivation to learn something. And then we're going to look at the cognitive implications, or what happens when people use conversational AI versus traditional search engines as they search for these types of information. And you might assume that there's an implicit aim when you're searching for information. You might also want to remember, retain that information accurately. And people usually tend to think that conversations will be helpful for this type of a process, and we'll study whether that's actually the case. In order to look at this type of a situation, what I'm going to be turning to is going to be a literature from cognitive psychology, which talks about transactive memory systems. This is a framework where people try to explain how groups collectively remember information. There are two terms. One of them is called internal memory, which is going to be the person themselves, the user, and what they remember. And there's also a term called external memory, which is the user's awareness of what everyone else knows in the environment. And together, these two create the whole knowledge ecosystem. And in our particular case, what we're thinking about is that conversational AI, it's going to be just a new type of external memory storage for people that would allow them to keep the things that they themselves cannot necessarily remember. And let me give you one more particular example. If you're a marketing manager for a company, for example, you might know very well about the recent campaigns that you have run, but you don't necessarily know the lines of code to analyze those, but you do know who to go to, perhaps your data scientist or your developer in some cases. So that's the exact type of relationship here with transactive memory systems. And previous work has demonstrated that people search a lot of things on the internet. In these particular literatures, it was usually Google. And using internet conflates the boundaries between people's own knowledge, the internal memory, and the external memory, what internet gives you. And what we're predicting is that this type of a knowledge gap, what you think you're going to remember, but what you actually end up remembering, the discrepancy between these two things is going to be even more so in conversational AI that relies on very informal language, additional words, this dialogue nature. So that's what we're going to be testing in multiple studies. Here on my screen, you see one example stimuli. The search query is fixed, but the way in which the information is provided is quite different between the two. On the left, that's exactly how actually Google gives in their overview section. But on the right, it's going to be an overly exaggerated, very conversational and narrative form that is quite informal and includes stylistic differences between the two. But the core pieces of information, the actual knowledge, is actually fixed between these two. So we assign our participants to be one or the other condition, and then we ask them two sets of questions. The first set of questions is about metacognitive perceptions. We ask our participants to tell us how easy was it to understand this particular information. We also ask them how likely they themselves think they can explain it to someone else. And later, we give them an actual memory task. So instead of asking about the likelihood of being able to explain it, we tell them to explain it for us. And we identify these core pieces of information that's equally present in both of these queries or both of these search platforms, and then we code for absence or presence of these individual pieces of information. And then we create a measure for this potential knowledge gap, which is going to be the difference between what people expect versus how they actually remember or retain the information. On my slide, I'm showing you two bar plots in which when the knowledge gap has a positive magnitude associated with it, that means that people remember information much worse than they expect or anticipate remembering. And if it's a negative measure, it is actually flipped, meaning that people remember better than what they anticipate. And that's the exact dynamic that we see between conversational AI, leading people to remember less than what they anticipate, and traditional Google search engines, leading people to remember more than they originally anticipate. And I told you that there were core pieces of information we look for. We originally started coding for these using human annotators, undergraduate Stanford students, and we also replicate this exact same thing by using GPT itself to help us code for things for efficiency, and then getting an aggregate measure using a combination of humans and GPT, and we find the exact same pattern across the board. So that was basically a main effect, that if you have these overly narrative, overly conversational language, that might actually distract people from the actual pieces of knowledge and not help them remember them, but instead make them remember other parts of the language as opposed to the core dynamics or the core information that is, in a way, hidden in these types of chatbot responses. So that's what we study in more depth in study 3. Instead of one search query, we have 6 different search queries, so people do this multiple times. And we demonstrate some process evidence for this type of a narrative distraction. In particular, after replicating our original main effect, meaning that conversational AI leading to an enlarged knowledge gap, what we then show is that conversational AI also leads to a narrative distraction, and participants, as a result of this, were more likely to correctly identify that they received this information from a conversational AI instead of a traditional search engine, which in turn leads to this increased knowledge gap. It's almost like going back to the transactive memory system dynamics. You yourself have your own language, conversational AI has its own language, and you don't necessarily feel the need to be able to learn it, and there's so much distraction in the language that it's also hard to do that cognitively. So we demonstrate this mediation effect as the beginning of a process evidence here. In the last study that I'm going to be sharing with you today, we were interested in looking at individual differences. Are there things that make someone more or less susceptible to this type of a conversational AI knowledge gap? And if so, perhaps we can create interventions that would help those people in particular. For this, we ran additional studies 2 weeks later than the original one with the exact same people, and we collected people's epistemic beliefs, which is going to be the idea of how people think knowledge is fixed versus fluid. So if they think that there is a reality that does not change, we captured those tendencies to have that idea. And then the second individual difference measure we were interested in looking at, because of the narrative components and the nature of conversational AI, that was mental simulation. This is the idea of if someone is reading something or in general in life, are they able to rehearse these in their minds, create mental models, or simulate that information mentally? And that we thought would be relevant here if people are learning something from conversational AI as well. And lastly, we had an outcome, which means that in 2 weeks later, we were curious if people still thought they would remember and be able to explain this particular knowledge they learned. So we measured overconfidence relative to all of the other participants that took the study. How would you be able to explain today what you learned then? So these 3 variables, right now on my screen, I'm showing you 3 scatter plots. In terms of magnitude, I would say small but reliable effects of epistemic beliefs and mental simulation predicting the magnitude of the knowledge gap, meaning that people who think information is fixed, more susceptible to this type of thing. Same for mental simulation, and this happened regardless of which group participants were in. So each of these dots in my scatter plots are a person, regardless of their condition. And then overconfidence seems to have persisted as well. So even after 2 weeks, people who originally thought they learned more, they seem to be still pretty overconfident about these things. With that, I would like to summarize our findings. We started with this overarching question of, can we use search intents, motivations or goals people have when they search for information online, whether using traditional search engines or conversational chatbots? It looks like among the 4 search intents practitioners use, informational search queries are the only types that people prefer going to conversational AI as opposed to sticking with something like Google. And for this reason, for the rest of our studies, we concentrated on only informational search intents and queries that allowed us to perhaps teach participants some sort of knowledge. And what we see is that if this knowledge is presented in more extreme narrative form with informal language and conversational additional words, participants thought they would remember better, but they eventually end up creating this knowledge gap and not retaining that information over time. And lastly, I've shown some evidence for you for 2 individual difference measures. This effect is even larger for epistemic beliefs and people who can mentally simulate knowledge in their minds. And the confidence seems pretty persistent across the time. With that, if you're a manager wondering about how should we create our own chatbots, perhaps it's better to provide the more straightforward, the more direct language, especially in a situation where this type of an engagement is not quite sustained, but more of a initial one-shot situation, I would suggest going for more of the Google type of responses, even if it's a chatbot that you're dealing with. I think with that, I'm going to end here and ask you if you have any questions for me. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Maybe because conversational AI is relatively new, but the types of search questions, information search questions that I do with ChatGPT versus Google, if you will, are different. So if I'm looking for just basic information, I go to Google. But if I want to go deep into a question, then I go to ChatGPT. Maybe things are going to change over time. But I wonder if these differences matter, like, what people use different tools for.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that goes back to our original thoughts about looking at the intents too, because people are not going to be willing to look into conversational AI for certain things if you just need a number, if you just need something from yesterday or today, very recent information. So that's relevant, but in those cases, I would argue that memory and retention is not necessarily the ultimate goal either. But implicitly, if you're going something more in depth, for the most part, you tend to want to remember that information so that you can use it not potentially once, but in later situations as well. So I think that's quite relevant, but I would think that the informational search queries is the very reason why we see this effect in conversational AI.
Thank you. Very interesting. I'm curious about the heterogeneous effect of using conversational AI, because I think some human beings prefer different types of media when learning. Some people prefer reading a book, others prefer listening to a book. And people have different abilities in terms of retaining the information depending on the media of that learning process. So I'm curious about the heterogeneous patterns.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. So far what I have shown you was more of the aggregate effects. So I think we might see this heterogeneity in learning styles, or perhaps the multimodality LLMs. They might be better suited for certain people who can mentally simulate things and make that process easier for them. Yet at the same time, I think language and the amount of information these conversational chatbots provide, in addition to the core pieces of information you want them to remember, it's going to be probably relevant across the board, just because our memory systems have a limited cognitive capacity, and we tend to prioritize based on certain cues. But if that information is very specific in front of you, I think that's still going to be helpful for people. Yet, I'm sure there's additional individual difference variables we haven't yet tapped into.
Hi, Elizabeth Ponticus from UC Davis. This is really interesting. I have a pretty basic question. With knowledge gap, that's how much you know versus how much you expect to know. Mm-hmm. Is it driven more by how much people know? Like, are you actually seeing differences in that? Or is it that the expectations have been set differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's going to be coming from the memory piece. People tend to have a smaller difference between traditional search engines versus conversational AI for the fluency or the metacognitive perceptions, but most of the effect is driven by the recall.
Thank you so much. I know that we have more questions, but we are sticking to the schedule. We are going to have lots of time for networking, the breaks, and the reception, so please feel free to come talk to our speakers and ask your questions later on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.